no matter what I say, as descriptive as I may be with the writing, you're not going to have the exact same experience as me or as any other reader.
Right.
And that's what I find fascinating about writing, is that it truly is a collaboration between author
And reader.
Yeah,
It is.
Exactly.
Good evening and welcome to Art After Dark, where you get to learn all about arts and culture in West Texas, and I get to live out my Dick Cavett fantasy. Tonight, we are continuing our series with the Literary Deathmatch participants, and I'm so excited to have on the show author James Wade. James, thank you so much.
Oh, I'm so excited to be here. This is kind of one of the coolest things. I follow this along as you guys produce each episode, and I'm just like, you know what? One day I'm going to be there. And it's no pressure. It's no pressure on you. It's no pressure on me. But the fact that I'm here, it's kind of cool.
It is very cool for me too. I've been a big fan of you since I met you at your first literary death match here in 2022, which you won,
Oh, wow.
by the way. Congratulations for that. That was amazing. So this is your second literary death match here. Have you participated in any of the other literary death matches in Texas?
So listen, if you want to retire on top, you have to be very selective about how you go about competing in literary deathmatch. In 2022, I was fortunate enough to be the champion. I would love to say that I don't remark about that to everyone in every person that I meet. However, I do have the belt, which I brought with me to pass along to the new champion. But the thing is, whether it's Spur Awards or Reading the West Awards or whatever, I try to impart on people that, like, there is no such award like the Literary Deathmatch Award. And no, I'm happy to be back as a judge this year because this is just it's such a cool thing. We have so many cool writers, so many cool creatives that get into this. I'm super pumped, and as hard as it will be to give up the belt, I'm happy to do it because when it comes to deserving artists, this is one of the coolest things that Texas has to offer, and which is really cool because we're out here in the middle of West Texas. I grew up in East Texas. This is a million miles away, right?
It really is.
It really is, but it's fascinating that way, and I love the basically the collaborative of talent and the collaborative of amazing storytellers that you guys get together for this. It truly is remarkable, and so yeah, I'm just fortunate to be here, and so that's the weird way of saying, sure, I'll give up my title if it means someone else glowing, you know.
Well, and I have to remind you too that you won against some very stiff competition. We had Sarah Bird here. We had Kathy Valentine of the Go-Go's here. I mean, it was really stiff competition.
It was, and I'll say this because Sarah Bird is, what is she? She's a Texas legend, right?
She really is.
I mean, that's a literary legend when it comes to Texas writers, and I'll say this for Sarah Bird. She and I have a love-hate relationship. And what I mean by that is that I love her and she hates to lose.
Right.
And so
you're frenemies is what you're saying. You're frenemies.
Exactly.
Yeah.
No, she is with the Austin Chronicle, I think she's been the best writer in Austin for the last 7 out of 8 years or something.
Yeah.
And I hang my hat on the fact that I'm a runner up every year. I'm just like,
right.
Well, look, Sarah Bird was the winner, so I mean, what can you expect from that? But yeah, Kathy Valentine with the Go-Go's, I mean, she absolutely killed it last was it 2 years ago that she came in here and just destroyed it? I mean, she was amazing. Well, that's what's really cool about this though is not to reiterate, but we're out here, we're in Odessa, Texas, right? And that's who can we pull to this region that has a stamp on the arts, and you guys do that better than anyone. Whether it's David Sedaris coming out and talking to an auditorium full of people, or whether it's Kathy Valentine with the Go-Go's, or Sarah Bird, who is absolutely a Texas literary legend. you guys bring in the biggest and brightest folks, and yeah, it's honestly, it's like it's very humbling to even be a part of this. Like, I I've watched Art After Dark several times, and I'm
Yeah.
going, oh, that would be really cool to be a part. And so now I'm here, and I'm going, oh, what am I supposed to do? I don't know, because look at everybody else that's been here, and so that's part of it, right? That's part of the whole mystique and aura of this. Is just amazing what you guys have built here in Odessa.
Well, thank you very much. You were just mentioning that you grew up in East Texas, so let's kind of talk about your literary origin story, where you grew up, and how you fell into Writers League of
Sure.
Texas, and got your work published.
Yeah, that's origin stories, especially especially today, are such a thing that it's fascinating because some of them are almost unbelievable, right? And then some of them are very banal, and it's like okay. And I think mine is a little bit in the middle, to where I grew up in East Texas, as you mentioned, and we talk about representation a
Yeah,
lot, right?
yeah,
Okay, so if you see yourself represented in film, if you see yourself represented in whatever the occupation is, like that's how you pursue your goal. And for me, growing up in East Texas, there wasn't like we didn't have authors come into the classroom, right, and
right,
say
yeah,
this is the
yeah,
publishing world, this is how you get a book done.
hmm,
And so to me, the publishing world was something that happened in New York,
yep,
which was a million miles away.
right,
And so I was like, well, I know people that work at the newspaper.
yeah,
Maybe I could go into journalism. Maybe that's how I could best use my writing capabilities. Uh, but I will give much credit to, in I want to say 2017, Joe Lansdale, who
oh, talk about another legend.
well, not another the legend,
Mm,
right? Like Joe Lansdale is, as far as East Texas is concerned, Joe Lansdale is like the guy, right?
right,
And Joe Lansdale was kind enough to uh, not reach out to me, but to accept my
mm,
accept my invitation, which is like, Joe, please, I'm trying to write. What do I do? And we had we had a lunch together, and he basically said, listen, if you want to write and if you want to do this for a living and to do this for real, then the most advice I can give you, or the best advice I can give you, would be to not get discouraged. And that sounds so sentimental. It sounds so obvious, but the thing is like when you're writing, when you're creating anything, like it's a tough gig, dude. Like
y-
that's
you're most vulnerable when
of
you're
course
putting
you're
your
vulnerable. Oh
stuff.
my god, of course you're vulnerable, right?
So you're afraid of rejection,
Yeah. Oh,
yeah,
absolutely. You're afraid of rejection. You're afraid of. I mean, even before you get to the rejection. So I always So I teach writing classes with the Writers League of Texas,
yeah,
which I know you've talked about on this program. We have picked such a wonderfully awful medium, meaning meaning that if you want to record an album, it takes a couple months. If you want to record if you want to film a movie, maybe it takes a year tops. And then how do we distribute that? Okay, well, Randy, would you like to take 3 minutes out of your life to listen to this song?
right,
Okay,
yeah.
that's fine. How about, would you like to take 3 months to read this novel? Would you like to take a week to listen to this album versus again several months to listen to this book? And how are you going to share it? I mean, it's one of those things where writing is like the when it comes to return on investment, it gets a little dicey. But all that being said, I would propose this: if you and I, Randy, were watching Titanic, the ship is about to hit the iceberg, yes?
Yep.
And we watch it together, and we watch it hit the iceberg, and we watch the emotion, and we watch the reaction, and all these things, and we experience that together. However, in writing, there is a collaboration that happens, right? The movie, we watch the iceberg and the ship. In song, it's a C chord is a C chord. We
Yeah.
experience it all the same way. But in writing, there's a collaboration that says, if I say there is a small cabin on a hill with an oak tree, and there's a red sunset on this cabin in the hill with the oak tree. No matter what I say, as descriptive as I may be with the writing, you're not going to have the exact same experience as me or as any other reader.
Right.
And that's what I find fascinating about writing, is that like it truly is a collaboration between author and reader.
It
Yeah,
is.
exactly. And so for that, uh, it's hard to say exactly how we collaborate that way, but it is. It's a thing. It's a collaboration.
It is. But, one of the things I like so much about reading and
Mm.
why I'm such a book nerd is because, like you mentioned Titanic, and Titanic is a cultural touchstone, right?
Sure.
So many people have seen it, and you sit there collectively in the movie theater. So that experience, even though every single person that walks out of that theater has a little bit of a different take on the film, it's still a communal experience.
Sure.
And for me, when I'm reading a book, especially when I just fall in love with the writing, right, the first thing I want to do when I finish is talk to someone about it. And I want to know what they took away from the book that was different. And so, having either it's a one-on-one conversation or it's a book club. The Ellen Noel Art Museum here has a really great book club, and I love reading their selections and then going to the museum and sitting in a room with people and talking about the book, because that red sunset means something different to someone else than it does to me. And the way you were saying it just now, I was picturing it in my head, and I know that the way I pictured it in my head is different than the way that you had it
Right.
when you were saying it or putting it down on paper. So it is. Reading is a communal experience. It's just done in such a different way, and I find it very, very valuable as well. So tell me, when was your first book published?
Ooh, so my first book, All Things Left Wild, was published in June of 2020, which was
What a great time to have a new book.
which was a wonderful time. No, it was right in the middle of the pandemic, but I will say this: uh, I feel like the publishing world is a little divided on when you published a book, and in the pandemic, um, there were opportunities that I missed out on. Right,
Yep.
like I would have loved to come to Odessa. I would have loved to come to several
Yeah.
places in Texas, but everything was shut down. Right, and I
We had to
understand that.
cancel an entire book festival.
Oh Jesus, yeah. No,
Yeah.
I was supposed to go to New York
Yeah.
for the New York Book Festival,
Right.
and it was shut down. And those are things that are tough to swallow. However, on the flip side, I mean, just being honest, like I was able to go to or to attend virtually the Library Journals Day of Dialogue, the at the same time as the Arizona Poison Pinned
Yeah.
uh, they're, in other words, I was able to do things that I couldn't do physically. I was able to do virtually, and it was weird because, like, it's the
Yeah.
pandemic.
Yeah.
You don't want to admit that maybe that helped you. Maybe it did help the novel. I don't know. Like that's it's very strange and very tough to figure out. But even 4 years later, we don't really know. I mean,
Yeah.
there I've talked to a lot of people in the publishing industry who were like, that was the worst time. And I've also talked to other people who were like, it actually kind of worked out. I think I'm kind of somewhere in the middle, if
Sure.
that makes sense.
Well, something that I found interesting on a personal level is I know so many people during the pandemic that were just casual readers that became voracious readers because
Mm-hmm.
there was, basically nothing else to do. And the exact opposite happened to me because I was so anxious. I couldn't concentrate enough to read. And it actually added to the depression of that that whole time, because there was a great wealth of choices to read at that time. And I saw people that were going back and just rereading classics or
Yep.
reading books that they'd never read before, and I couldn't do it. And so that was, and I felt like I was never going to be able to read again.
No, I did actually. Similarly, I did the same thing to where there were folks who were like, my debut novel, which came out in 2020, was All Things Left Wild, and it had this uh, escapist feel to it,
Yeah.
right? Which is like we talked about, mountain ranges, wide open spaces from the Arizona, New Mexico territories to Texas, and people were like, "Oh yeah, we're stuck inside," so we gravitate toward that, and that was great, and I understood. But at the same time, as a reader, I was like, "Oh God, I'm starting to feel a little boxed in here,"
Yeah.
right? Yeah,
Yeah.
and so I get that. Like I was, that's a tough thing, and honestly, 4 years later, it's not necessarily that much different, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
I think what happened with the pandemic, and this is my own opinion, I think what happened is we got very used to trying to prioritize what we read,
Yeah.
trying to prioritize how we thought, trying to
Mm-hmm.
prioritize the way that we feel, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, by the
No.
way. But yeah, I in the last few years, I've found myself very much being like, what is a priority and what is just kind of like a vacation, right? Like
Right.
what's a
Yeah.
beach read?
Yes.
And while I do think there's room for that style of fiction, I've become a little more like discerning when it comes to
Yeah.
what I pick to read.
Well, it's a time commitment as much as it
Yeah,
is a mental commitment, and
yeah,
so we are really reevaluating our priorities. And if I am going to give up some of my time to give to you
mm,
as an author, or for a book, then I have to know that this is something that is going to be an experience that I will get something out of. Maybe not necessarily enjoy, because art is not always there for enjoyment. Sometimes it's there to make you think, and that's a good thing too.
sure,
Um, but the first book of yours that I read was right after you were here for Literary Deathmatch, and I think it was Beasts of the Earth
yeah,
that had just come out, and so that was the first book of yours that I read, and it was set in a section of Texas that I was very familiar with, and so it really felt like a little piece of home.
sure.
So it was really great to have that, and then have that situation, because it was. I would you consider it maybe a thriller? I would.
Yeah, I don't. Yeah, I think
Yeah.
that's accurate. I think a thriller. I think a murder mystery.
Yeah.
Like I mean, that's a Beasts of the Earth for me was quite different as the third novel from the first two. Um, but you're kind of no pressure, but you're kind of the target audience, right? Like someone who understands the isolation, the loneliness of Central West Texas,
Yeah.
and what it is that like draws folks here in a way that is not always idealistic, but is more practical.
Yeah.
And Harlan LeBlanc, who is the main character in Beasts of the Earth, and who is my favorite character, by the way. I just,
Oh, really?
yeah, well,
Oh, yeah.
I recently posted like I've had, this is 4 novels in, but the third one was Beasts of the Earth. Harlan LeBlanc is someone who speaks to me every day in a weird way, because I very much categorize him as someone who both acknowledges and accepts the realities of Texas, which
Mm-hmm.
I am a Texan through and through.
I would never have guessed by your
Yeah,
wording.
right, exactly. Um, straight from Nevada. No, I'm a Texan through and through, and it's one of those things where I have this love-hate relationship with our state.
Mm-hmm.
But if I can characterize that in fiction, then I think Harlan LeBlanc is a really good example of like someone who wants to be very individualistic, who wants to be libertarian in a way, but
Mm-hmm.
who is also very drawn to and very tied to the rationale of the entire state, the entire government, the entire law system. And that's tough to balance in fiction, right? Because we
Yeah.
don't want to preach to people,
Right.
right? Like, because that's no fun as a
No.
reader, but we want to get there. And so Harlan for me is kind of the way that medium or that bridge between what I feel as a writer and what he is as a character.
Well, it's interesting you bring up that love hate thing because for so long in my life, I never read a Western. I would never read anything that was set in Texas. I was like, I live here. I grew up here. I know all of the stories. I don't have to read them. For me, books were a way of experiencing things outside of the state and outside of the country and into different worlds. And, you know, it really was that escapism kind of thing.
Sure.
And it was not until I got older where I realized that reading things like Beasts of the Earth that were set in Texas, and you can identify some of the settings and some of the characters. You know, Harlan was very relatable to me. I mean, I could definitely see why he's your favorite character, but being able to find those little touchstones, I understand why people read books set in their neighborhood, and then you do sneaky things like, you know, putting things into the book that might make you think a little bit different about the way that you grew up or where you live or the way that you behave towards your community members and your place in that community. And it was just so beautifully done.
Well, those were very kind words, and I appreciate that. Like, one thing, so like Larry McMurtry, who is,
Yeah.
kind of a deity here in Texas, he once
Saint
mentioned,
Larry.
yeah, right, Saint Larry. He once mentioned that like he didn't spend all this time in Texas in order to not be
Right
able to
about
talk about
Texas.
it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so that's kind of how I felt with Harlan. Is like I didn't grow up for 35 years in Texas to not be able to write about Texas and to write about the characters. And so yeah, it's difficult, Randy, as you know, like you want to give there's a very thin line, right? Like
Hmm.
you want to be able to give this honest representation of the state we live in, the culture we live
Yeah.
in, the people we grew up with, but you don't want to, or certainly I don't. It's not a it's I'm not chastising, right? Like
No.
it's not a condemnation of anybody uh, more than it is a representation of how we go about just our day to day. Like I've talked about in the past, like political ideologies and political motivations in novels. There is some of that, of course, but that's not the goal. The goal is more of like, can we fully realize a human character?
Yeah.
And in that full realization of a human character, what does that look like? And it usually is a lot more complicated
Yeah.
than left or right or good or bad. Like it's something that's just very intriguing, very nuanced. I know
Yeah.
that like traditionally like we're not nuance is a very weird thing because we want to be black or white, we don't want to be
Yes.
gray, but yeah, nuance is what I'm after because for me, both as a Texan and honestly just as a person, nuance is tough.
It
I want to
is.
get there. I want to find that balance. I mean, shit, being alive is hard. Can I say shit?
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, shit, being alive is hard. We want to find that balance to where we can be both vulnerable and authoritative and compassionate and willing and all of these
Yeah.
things, and that's a very tough balance to recreate.
It really is. You know, we do. We as as human beings, we crave certainty.
Yeah.
We want certainty. But I think that the way that you write your characters and you plot your stories are very, like you said, it's observational.
Sure.
It's not condemnation. It's not preachy. It's just these are who people are, or these are the situations
Yeah.
they're in, and the readers are left to be able to make up their own minds. And that, I think, is the best way to establish that kind of nuance, is allow the reader to make up their own mind about something, and you do that really well. But you have a new book out, don't you?
I do. Hollow Out the Dark just came out in August of this year, August 20th. and it is more than anything I've ever written before. It is absolutely a deep dive into what we're speaking of, which is like, how do we find that balance? Everything I've written before is very much a coming of age or a
Yeah.
loss of innocence.
Sure.
So we have young characters, and they come across that moment that is kind of it's so formative, right? And I love that. I love that as a reader, as a thinker, as a writer. But at the same time, it is a little bit of low hanging fruit, right? Like
Sure.
it is a little. I'm
Yeah.
not gonna say easy, but it's kind of like very approachable.
Yeah.
Young person realizes maybe that things are tougher than they thought. So with Hollow Out the Dark, I wanted to challenge myself a little bit. So our characters are in their mid to late 30s. They have gone through World War One. They've gone through the Spanish flu. They've gone through these moments that have hardened them as characters. And so the next question becomes, once you've passed that loss of innocence or that coming of age, what do you do? What do you do? How do you cope with the world? And even though this is set in the early 1930s, I very much related to it in modern day. I'm like, okay, dude, we hear every day how terrible things are, right?
Yeah.
And I don't want to discount that. Like, things are terrible. They're across the world. We see suffering, we see loss. How do we then cope with that? How do we move forward? Uh, one obvious example would be we just ball our heads up. We completely let it overwhelm us. We
Right.
can't move forward. Another example, we are naive to it. We block it out. We say, you know what? It doesn't matter. Me and my people, we're fine. We're going to go about our lives as is. Okay, that's kind of another extreme. But the more moderate, or certainly the more nuanced version is, I understand the world is maybe not what I thought it was when I was young. I understand there's darkness here, but can I single out the darkness? Can I look at it and go, you know what? I see you, I acknowledge you, but I will turn you into poetry. I will hollow out the dark, which is where the title of the novel comes from. I will hollow you out, and I will find my own example of happiness, or at the very least wholeness. Right? Like, this is something I talked about with my wife when I was writing this. Is I was like, I want these characters to burrow out a bit of happiness, and she said, well, what is happiness? Right?
Oh wow.
Yeah. She was
Simple
like, what is
question,
happiness?
complex answer.
Yeah. She was like, what is happiness versus wholeness? Wholeness seems to encompass happiness, but also sorrow, but also wanting to move forward. And so I tried that with these characters. Is like, what could we do? How could we make them nuanced in a way that moves forward? Um, and that's tough, though, right? It's tough.
Yeah.
We're talking about a novel. Yeah, it's tough in a novel. It's tough in real life. I
Yeah.
mean, my
Yeah.
goodness, like, look at I don't take much solace in the fact that it's very hard to be alive. It's very hard to talk to anyone, whether it's in the arts or business sector or whatever, and go, you know what? I feel very confident about the future. I feel very pumped up about where things are going. Like, no, that's a tough thing to do, but at the same time, I think that shooting for that middle ground and shooting for that nuance between depression and joy, or maybe like awareness and naivety, is like, it's a very cool thing. Like, because if we can make it right there, and if we can do things like what we're doing here in Odessa, like, that kind of makes it worth it, right? I mean,
Yeah.
that's, no pressure, but
Well,
you are kind of doing a service here.
well, thank you. I mean, we all need to do that. Is you just even if the joy is 5 minutes, that's
Yeah.
5 minutes more than we had before, right? So you find the things. I always think of it as finding the things to live for.
Yeah.
That's what you do, and it's little things like Art After Dark and Literary Deathmatch.
Yeah.
Those are the
Absolutely.
things. So the title of the book is Hole Out the Dark.
Yep.
It is available in bookstores now. Get it at Front Street Books in Alpine, Texas. Shout out. James, I really want to thank you so much for being here tonight. Thank you all for tuning in tonight. As a reminder, Odessa Arts is doing our fall membership drive right now. Please consider becoming a member of Odessa Arts at odessaarts.org. And until next time, James, cheers. Thank you for being on the show.
Indeed. Thank you, sir, for having me.